The camera is already rolling. The audience is settled. The lights are warm. And in the middle of a familiar daytime television set, a single question hangs in the air. One that turns a routine conversation into a moment people still talk about. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This was not a scandal. It was not an argument in the tabloid sense. But it was a live television exchange that revealed something deeper. About power, perception, and what happens when two influential women meet in front of millions, with no script to hide behind. The show was The View, a platform known for blending politics, culture, and personal stories in real time. The host was Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of live television, respected for her directness and unfiltered honesty. And the guest was Michelle Obama, one of the most recognizable and carefully watched public figures in modern American history. On paper, this should have been a comfortable conversation. Two women with overlapping audiences. Two voices often praised for authenticity. A daytime talk show appearance meant to promote dialogue, reflection, and shared values. But live television has a way of exposing the unexpected. And sometimes the most powerful moments are not loud. They are quiet, controlled, and impossible to edit away. To understand why this exchange mattered, you have to understand what live TV represents. There are no second takes, no post-production smoothing. Every pause, every shift in posture, every change in tone is seen exactly as it happens. And when the guest is someone like Michelle Obama, whose words are weighed, replayed, and analyzed across political and cultural lines, every moment carries consequence. Michelle Obama did not arrive on daytime television as just another guest. By the time she sat at that table, she had already redefined the role of First Lady for a new generation. She was known for balancing warmth with firmness, relatability with discipline. Her public image was built on intention. Every interview mattered. Every appearance had a purpose. Whoopi Goldberg, on the other hand, was not there to perform deference. As a longtime co-host of The View, she had interviewed presidents, activists, artists, and controversial figures alike. Her role on the show was not to flatter, but to ask what the audience at home might be thinking, and to do it without hesitation. That balance between respect and responsibility is where the tension lives. The episode opened like many others. Polite greetings, smiles, applause from the studio audience, a sense of familiarity. But beneath the surface, there was weight. Because Michelle Obama was not just speaking as herself. She was speaking as someone whose life had been shaped by public scrutiny, racial expectation, political pressure, and relentless commentary. And Whoopi Goldberg understood that. This was not a surprise ambush. It was not a viral gotcha moment engineered for clicks. What made this exchange powerful was precisely the opposite. It was calm. It was measured. And because of that, it landed harder. The conversation moved through topics the audience expected: family, public service, life after the White House. Michelle Obama spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived under a microscope and survived it. Her tone was composed. Her words were deliberate. She was in control of the room. But live shows are built on momentum, and momentum invites transition. At a certain point, Whoopi Goldberg shifted. Not abruptly, not aggressively, but noticeably. Her posture changed. Her voice slowed. And when she spoke next, it was clear she was no longer asking a safe question. The audience did not gasp. There was no dramatic music cue. But something in the room tightened. This is the moment people later replayed. Not because of what was said immediately, but because of what it forced into the open. A subject that rarely surfaces comfortably on daytime television. A reality that public figures often navigate privately, but seldom address head-on while cameras are rolling. Michelle Obama listened. She did not interrupt. She did not deflect. But for a brief moment, just long enough to register, she paused. In live television, a pause can speak louder than a statement. What followed was not confrontation in the traditional sense. There was no raised voice, no sharp retort. Instead, there was a controlled exchange that revealed the complexity of being both admired and constrained by public expectation. It showed how even the most composed figures must sometimes recalibrate in real time. For viewers watching at home, many multitasking, half listening, the tone shift was subtle. But for those paying attention, it was unmistakable. This was no longer just an interview. It was a moment of truth unfolding without a safety net. And that is why it mattered, because it showed how power operates differently when it is questioned respectfully but directly. It showed how someone like Michelle Obama navigates that space between honesty and responsibility under the pressure of a live broadcast. And it showed how a seasoned host like Whoopi Goldberg understands when to let silence do the work. The View has always been about conversation, but occasionally it becomes something more, a mirror reflecting the tension between public narrative and personal reality. This was one of those times. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, but something shifted. And as the cameras kept rolling and the audience leaned in, it became clear that this exchange would not simply fade into the background of daytime TV history. Because once a question is asked live and answered live, it cannot be taken back. And what happened next is where the story truly begins. Long before Michelle Obama ever sat down at that table, the expectations around her were already firmly in place. From the moment she entered the national spotlight, Michelle Obama was treated differently. Not just as a political figure, but as a symbol. Supporters saw her as grace under pressure. Critics scrutinized her tone, her expressions, even her choice of words. Every appearance carried an unspoken demand. Be strong, but not too strong. Be honest, but never uncomfortable. Be real, but always reassuring. By the time she transitioned out of the White House, that pressure didn't disappear. It transformed. Interviews were no longer about policy, but about legacy. About identity. About what it meant to exist in a public role shaped by history, race, and gender, all at once. And Michelle Obama understood that better than anyone. She had spent 8 years answering questions that were rarely asked of her predecessors in the same way. Daytime television, especially a show like The View, occupied a unique space in that landscape. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a political debate. It was a conversation, sometimes friendly, sometimes uncomfortable, broadcast live to millions of households. The audience wasn't just watching. They were listening while making breakfast, folding laundry, scrolling phones. And yet, moments from that table had a way of cutting through the noise. Whoopi Goldberg knew that. As a host, Whoopi Goldberg had built her reputation on asking what others might avoid. She was not interested in rehearsed talking points. Her strength on the show came from her ability to balance empathy with directness. She had interviewed presidents, survivors, artists, and activists. And she understood something fundamental about live television. Authenticity cannot be forced, but it can be invited. In the days leading up to Michelle Obama's appearance, there was already quiet anticipation. Not hype in the tabloid sense, but interest. Viewers knew this wouldn't be a superficial visit. Michelle Obama didn't do those. Her interviews tended to go deeper, touching on personal experiences that resonated widely, but always on her terms. Still, there was an undercurrent. The cultural climate at the time was tense. Conversations about race, representation, and power were no longer confined to academic spaces or political panels. They were happening in living rooms, workplaces, and yes, on daytime television. Public figures were being asked, not demanded, but asked, to speak more openly about the realities behind their polished images. Michelle Obama had spoken about these issues before, but always carefully. She chose her moments. She chose her words. And she chose environments where nuance could survive. The View, however, was unpredictable by design. The panel format meant multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and a conversation that could pivot quickly. And because it was live, there was no buffer. No opportunity to rethink a response once it left her mouth. That didn't intimidate Michelle Obama, but it did require preparation. As the interview began, everything followed a familiar rhythm. The hosts welcomed her warmly. The audience applauded. There was laughter. Stories about family life after the White House. Reflections on public service. Michelle Obama was relaxed, confident, and articulate. She spoke with the ease of someone who had spent years under intense scrutiny and learned how to remain composed within it. But Whoopi Goldberg was listening closely. This is an important detail. On live television, the most significant moments often don't come from what's planned, but from what's sensed. A slight opening in tone. A theme that emerges naturally. A moment when a guest reveals more than they perhaps intended. As the conversation unfolded, themes of expectation and perception began to surface. Michelle Obama spoke about how people project onto public figures, how they assign narratives that may not reflect reality. She talked about the responsibility of being watched and the exhaustion that can come with constantly representing more than just oneself. The audience nodded. These were familiar ideas, expressed with clarity and restraint. But familiarity can be a doorway. Whoopi Goldberg, having navigated public life herself for decades, recognized the weight beneath those words. She understood that Michelle Obama's experiences were not abstract. They were lived, felt, and carried. And live television offered a rare opportunity to explore that truth without filters. The tension didn't announce itself loudly. There was no sharp turn. Instead, there was a subtle shift in pacing, a change in the type of question being asked. Less about what Michelle Obama had done, and more about how it had affected her. This is where anticipation builds, not because something has gone wrong, but because something is about to become real. Viewers at home might not have noticed it immediately, but in the studio, energy is tangible. Hosts feel it. Guests feel it. The audience feels it. It's the moment when a conversation moves from safe territory into something more exposed. Michelle Obama continued to answer thoughtfully. She maintained her composure. But there was a growing sense that the discussion was approaching a boundary, one that, once crossed, would require complete honesty or careful silence. And on live television, silence is a statement. Whoopi Goldberg didn't rush. She allowed the conversation to breathe. She let Michelle Obama speak. And in doing so, she set the stage for a question that wouldn't accuse or provoke, but would require reflection in real time. This is the paradox of respectful confrontation. It doesn't feel aggressive. It feels inevitable. As the seconds passed, the audience leaned in, sensing that the tone had changed. The smiles were still there, but they were quieter. The laughter had faded. The conversation had slowed, as if everyone understood that the next moment would matter. Michelle Obama sat poised, hands folded, eyes attentive. She had answered difficult questions before. But this was different. This wasn't a journalist pressing for a headline. This was a peer, in a shared space, asking something that touched the core of her public life. And because it was live, whatever came next would belong not just to the two women at the table, but to everyone watching. The question hadn't been spoken yet, but the room was already holding its breath. The moment did not arrive with drama. It arrived with quiet. On The View, silence is rare. The format is built on conversation, overlapping voices, reactions from the table, and applause from the audience. But in this moment, the energy slowed. The rhythm changed. And for a few seconds, nothing competed with the sound of breathing in the studio. Whoopi Goldberg leaned slightly forward. Her posture was relaxed, but her tone shifted, lower, more deliberate. This was not a casual follow-up. This was a question formed from listening. She spoke carefully. Not long. Not loaded with commentary. Just direct enough to matter. She asked Michelle Obama about the emotional weight of constantly being perceived through expectation, about whether there were moments when the public narrative felt heavier than the truth of her own experience. The words were calm, but their implication was not. The studio audience reacted before Michelle Obama did. There was a faint murmur, not surprise, not shock, but recognition. People understood what was being asked. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about policy. It was about identity under a microscope. Michelle Obama did not respond immediately. This is where live television reveals everything. Her eyes stayed on Whoopi Goldberg. Her expression remained composed, but her body language shifted almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders settled. Her hands paused. And then came the silence, just long enough to register, but not long enough to feel accidental. That pause mattered. In a pre-recorded interview, that moment might have been trimmed, smoothed over, or edited out entirely. But this was live. No edits. No cuts. Millions of viewers witnessed that brief recalibration. The moment a public figure decides how much of the private self to allow through. Michelle Obama inhaled, then spoke. Her voice was steady, controlled, but it carried weight. She acknowledged the reality of living inside expectations that were not always fair, not always accurate, and often exhausting. She spoke about how visibility can become a burden when people stop seeing the individual and start seeing only the symbol. She did not dramatize it. She did not frame herself as a victim. She simply stated it as fact. As she spoke, the camera cut briefly to Whoopi Goldberg, who nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. This was not a debate. It was an exchange. Michelle Obama continued, choosing her words with precision. She described the challenge of balancing authenticity with responsibility, of knowing that honesty, while powerful, can be misinterpreted when filtered through public expectation. She spoke about the discipline required to remain composed when the world is watching for flaws. The audience was silent. No applause. No interruptions. Just listening. This is what made the moment powerful. There was no escalation, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. The tension came from restraint, from two women allowing truth to surface without forcing it. Whoopi Goldberg did not interrupt. She did not redirect. She let the answer unfold fully. On live television, that choice is significant. It signals respect and awareness that the moment deserves space. Michelle Obama's response did not offer headlines. It offered clarity. She spoke about strength not as something loud, but as something sustained. About the cost of always being on. About the quiet work of protecting one's inner life while serving a public role. For viewers at home, this was easy to miss if they weren't paying attention. There were no viral soundbites in the traditional sense. But for those who were listening, it felt intimate, almost private, despite being broadcast live. Then something subtle happened. Michelle Obama finished her thought and stopped speaking. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to exist. Whoopi Goldberg held eye contact for a moment longer, then gently acknowledged the response. No follow-up question. No attempt to push further. Just a recognition that the truth had been spoken as far as it needed to be. The audience applauded, but softly. Not the loud, enthusiastic applause of entertainment, but the measured response of understanding. In that applause was relief. And respect. This was the point of no return. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because something had been revealed. A layer had been peeled back in real time, without performance or protection. Live television rarely allows for that kind of honesty without consequence. As the conversation moved on, the energy in the studio was different. Still respectful. Still calm. But changed. Everyone at the table understood that they had just witnessed something real. Something that could not be undone or reframed later. Michelle Obama remained composed. Whoopi Goldberg remained professional. The show continued. But the moment lingered. Because what happens on live TV does not end when the segment does. It follows the people involved beyond the studio, into public discussion, media analysis, and personal reflection. And as the cameras kept rolling, one question remained unspoken, but impossible to ignore. What happens after a truth like that is shared in front of millions? If you want to understand how that single exchange shifted the room, and what it meant in the moments immediately after, stay with the truth narrator. The next part is where the impact becomes visible. The moment passed, but its presence stayed in the room. On The View, conversations usually move quickly. Segments transition. Topics shift. Energy resets. But after Michelle Obama finished speaking, the studio did not immediately return to its usual rhythm. There was a subtle recalibration, felt more than seen. The audience applause faded, and what followed was a brief stillness. Not awkward. Not tense. Just reflective. It was the kind of pause that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something unscripted and sincere. Michelle Obama remained seated upright, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. She did not reach for humor to soften the moment. She did not add a qualifying remark. Her words stood on their own. That choice mattered. It signaled that what she had said was complete, that it did not require justification. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg handled the transition with experience. She didn't rush to fill the space. She didn't pivot abruptly to a lighter topic. Instead, she acknowledged the gravity of the exchange through restraint. A simple nod. A measured breath. Then gently, she guided the conversation forward. This is where seasoned live television hosting reveals itself, not in control, but in judgment. Other co-hosts reacted subtly. Some leaned back. Some glanced down briefly, as if processing what had been said. No one interrupted. No one attempted to redirect the narrative. The panel allowed the moment to settle before continuing. For viewers watching from home, the shift may have felt almost imperceptible. But in the studio, it was clear. The energy had changed. Not dramatically, but permanently for the remainder of the segment. Michelle Obama continued to answer subsequent questions with the same composure she had shown throughout the interview. But there was a difference now. Her tone carried a quiet firmness, as if a boundary had been respectfully acknowledged. The conversation remained cordial, but it no longer skimmed the surface. The audience responded accordingly. Applause came later, but it was measured. Laughter returned, but cautiously. The studio was no longer in performance mode. It was in listening mode. This is the immediate aftermath that rarely gets discussed. Live television is not just about what is said. It's about how people adjust once something meaningful enters the space. And in this case, everyone adjusted. Whoopi Goldberg did not revisit the question. That decision was intentional. On live TV, knowing when not to push further is as important as knowing when to ask. The exchange had reached its natural conclusion, and extending it would have risked turning reflection into discomfort. Instead, the show continued, on schedule, on format, but with a noticeable awareness. Michelle Obama did not appear shaken, but she did appear grounded. There was a sense that she had said something true, and that truth had landed as intended. Not as controversy, not as confession, but as clarity. When the segment eventually moved toward its close, the goodbye felt slightly different than the greeting had. Warmer, perhaps. More mutual. The applause at the end of the interview carried appreciation rather than excitement. Once the cameras cut away, the live moment was already becoming something else. Producers understood they had captured an authentic exchange. Viewers at home began replaying it in their minds. Social media discussions would later dissect not just the words, but the pause before them, the silence after them, and the way the room responded. But in that immediate aftermath, still inside the studio, the most striking thing was what didn't happen. There was no visible damage control, no awkward recovery attempt, no sense of regret from either side. That absence spoke volumes. Michelle Obama had navigated the moment on her terms. Whoopi Goldberg had asked the question responsibly, and The View had done what live television does at its best. It created space for truth without spectacle. Yet moments like this do not stay contained. Once a public figure articulates something personal in front of millions, the ripple effect begins almost immediately. Words are replayed, interpreted, contextualized, sometimes simplified, sometimes misunderstood. And while the studio lights dimmed and the show moved on to its next segment, the exchange had already started its journey beyond the set. Because the true impact of a live television moment is never measured by what happens in the room alone. It's measured by what follows. The impact of that live exchange did not announce itself loudly, but it endured quietly. And that is often how the most meaningful television moments survive. In the days that followed the broadcast of The View, there was no scandal cycle, no emergency statements, no clarifications issued by publicists. And yet, the moment circulated. Clips were shared. Transcripts were quoted. Viewers returned to that brief pause, that measured response, and that restrained follow-through. Because what Michelle Obama had articulated was not new, but the way it had been articulated, live and unfiltered, carried weight. As a public figure, Michelle Obama has long been praised for authenticity. But authenticity, when performed too deliberately, can lose its power. What made this exchange resonate was that it did not feel performed. It felt like a real answer to a real question, given in a moment that offered no protection except composure. Media commentary that followed focused less on controversy and more on substance. Analysts noted how rare it is for someone of Michelle Obama's stature to speak so plainly about the emotional cost of symbolic visibility, especially on daytime television, where conversations are often simplified for accessibility. The discussion extended beyond politics. It touched on leadership, on representation, on the expectation placed on certain figures to embody ideals without acknowledging the toll of doing so. For many viewers, particularly women, particularly people who had experienced being reduced to a symbol rather than seen as an individual, the moment felt validating. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Whoopi Goldberg's role in that moment was also widely recognized. As a host, Whoopi Goldberg did not dominate the narrative after the fact. She did not frame herself as having exposed anything. Instead, her restraint reinforced her credibility. She asked a question, allowed the answer, and let the audience decide its meaning. That approach matters. In an era where confrontation is often manufactured for attention, this exchange stood apart. It demonstrated that respect and seriousness can still produce compelling television. That a single, well-timed question, asked without aggression, can open a door that shouting never could. Over time, the moment became part of a broader conversation about how public figures are allowed to speak about their inner lives. Michelle Obama's response was later referenced in discussions about leadership fatigue, emotional labor, and the expectation of perpetual strength. And importantly, it did not redefine her public image, it deepened it. She remained admired, but she was also seen as human in a way that did not diminish her authority. If anything, it reinforced it. Strength, the moment suggested, is not the absence of burden, but the ability to carry it with clarity. That is why this exchange still matters. Not because it changed public opinion overnight, Not because it went viral in the traditional sense, but because it captured something rare on live television, a truthful moment handled with discipline by everyone involved. No edits, no spin, just presence. For The View, it reaffirmed the value of live conversation done responsibly. For Whoopi Goldberg, it underscored the power of asking the right question at the right time. And for Michelle Obama, it added another layer to a legacy defined not just by achievement, but by thoughtful honesty. In the end, the most powerful moments on television are not always the loudest. They are the ones that trust the audience enough to sit with silence, nuance, and reflection. And this was one of those moments. If you value stories that go beyond headlines, stories that examine what really happens when the cameras are live and the answers are real, subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and pass it along to someone who appreciates thoughtful storytelling. Because the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks calmly and stays with us long after the screen goes dark.